To some of this problem than we will find most anywhere else. And as far as I'm able to find out, this is the only copy of it that exists. And this is called The True Adept Illuminates and Initiates of the Hermetic Arts. This is in the form of a kind of biographical glossary. It is almost in the form of a certain biographical who's who in alchemy. And from the first page of this, we learn the definitions as they were used within the body of the alchemical school. The term adept is properly applied to one who has learned the great work and who has performed it. That is the proper term for an adept. The term illuminate or illuminate is properly related to one who has experienced the mystery of the work, but does not know how it is performed. This is a rather curious differentiation. The term initiate is one who has achieved to the knowledge of the method, but has not performed the work. Now this is the way in which the guild of the chemists was divided. Following this is a list, prefaced by the fact that it must always and ever be remembered that there are false adepts, false illuminates, and false initiates, but that the genuine ones can be determined only by those who have the knowledge to investigate their secret marks and symbols. Then we have here a list of the adepts of the school, both imaginary and historical, and also the degrees of their development within the school. We learn from this book, for instance, that according to the alchemical tradition, Moses was an adept. We learned that Solomon was an adept. And this brings us very close to the fact that Solomon was also supposed to have been a great architect and a master of those mysteries. Then we learn also, as we go on through these lists, some of the other names involved in this. The Apostle John, a sublime illuminate. Hermes, an adept. Orpheus, an adept. Apollonius of Rhodes, an initiate. Homer, an initiate. Ptolemy, an illuminate. Virgil, an initiate. You can go right down through this book, and you will find all of the principal names and their ranks in the school. We also learn that Avicenna was an initiate. Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, was an adept. St. Thomas Aquinas was an initiate. Roger Bacon was an initiate. Raymond Looney was an adept. I won't try to read them all because many of the names are not particularly important to us now. But this work carries on through all of the different steps of alchemy, pointing out that these different teachers, masters of the schools, were actually bound together in a pattern. Now when we take an alchemical tradition and we come to the discovery that it includes Orpheus and Homer, we know that we're not dealing with chemistry, because these men were not chemists. We were dealing with an esoteric system of which the alchemical schools in Europe were comparatively recent development. Bernays, an illuminate. Michael Meyer, an initiate. One of the interesting things we find as we go along through here is that a number of names that are a little better known to us are also to be found as we go near the end of the list. We know, for instance, that this list, strangely enough, ends with a comparatively familiar name, and that is Baron Emanuel Swedenborg, an Illuminate. Now, when we study Swedenborg and his association with Saint Germain and Cagliostro, we have reasons to believe that the book is probably correct. But this is, as far as I know, the only who's who of the Hermetic adepts there is. But the principle behind it is that the entire work was an integration, was a definite system devised for a purpose. And that purpose was concealed under a series of alchemical or magical symbols and devices, the meanings of which we will try to explain at least in part as this series progresses. Now, the next thing that I want to bring up in connection with the alchemical tradition is to try to orient what basically alchemy stood for. Generally and broadly, we know what it meant. We know that by transmutation was implied regeneration. We also know that the symbolism of alchemy was exact. Why? Because it was based upon an exact science, chemistry. We also realize that as we go into it, that perhaps the nearest parallel that we can find to it in our common experience in the modern world is yoga. In other words, alchemy was an esoteric discipline. It was a discipline based upon an exact science of human regeneration. Now, just as in almost all of the exact sciences of antiquity, it is assumed that the keys were lost, and that therefore the mystery of the cult or sect is no longer to be found. And this I question very greatly. The second point that I think we should try to realize and understand is that the alchemists were not only interested in the regeneration of man, but in the restoration of the philosophic empire as established in the concept of Plato. This restoration of the philosophic empire was to be undertaken by a broad political program. So alchemy penetrated and permeated practically every political and social state of the world, extending as far as China, throughout India, throughout the Near East, and even extending into the Central and South American areas of the Western Hemisphere, where chemistry had reached a fairly high degree of proficiency. Around the alchemical speculation, as it is, we have developed a great number of overtones. And these overtones can best be understood by reference perhaps to some of the alchemists themselves. Following this list, and only using approved members of the Mecca group, the aristocrats of the order, we find, for example, that certain alchemists are more reliable, more careful, and obviously more informed than others. Among the best and greatest informed of these adept alchemists was Raymond Lully. Another one highly proficient and skilled was Bacillus Valentinus, monk of St. Benedict. A third very highly efficient one was George Ripley, the English chemist. And then fourth, equally at least recognized and remembered for his important contributions to the subject, was Michael Sendivogius. These were among the great names in alchemy. Therefore, when we read them, taking in works such as the Triumphant Chariot of Antimonium by Basil Valentine, we come always upon lines like this: Woe, woe, woe unto the gold makers. And another line in Ripley which says that whoever believes that the transmutation of physical metals is the end of alchemy is a fool. All these things are tossed in. Very little is made up, because at that time it was advisable to unveil the secrets too completely. But the alchemists themselves have left in their published and outer writings irrefutable proof that they were not to be considered merely as chemists, that they were to be considered as the instruments of a secret purpose and art, and that this art they had inherited or brought down from a remote antiquity. The alchemical symbolism itself was very recent, but the method or mystery behind it was very old. The second and another important point is that the alchemical tradition moving into Europe Christianized itself intensely. But this Christianization was no part of its original symbolism. Gradually, therefore, we find the introduction of Christian figures and symbols into the alchemic arts. But wherever they are used in a purely alchemical sense, not in the sense of theology. Just as the mystical symbols of astrology and magic used by Bernays were not to be used in the magical astrological sense, but in a purely mystical sense, a matter which has been of considerable concern to students of the subject. One of the names associated with early alchemy was Paracelsus von Hohenheim. This great Swiss physician tells us that he was initiated into the mysteries of the spiritual art of chemistry by masters of this art in Constantinople, and that it was among the Muslims that he gained his first great knowledge of the secrets of transcendent chemistry. In all probability, he studied with the dervishes and other Eastern groups who had under another symbolism, the symbolism in some cases of music or song or poetry, had come to the same as with the famous troubadours and the Triad of Ronsard in France. All of these groups were bound together. Dante's Inferno was not intended to be a literal description of the netherworld. Milton's Paradise Lost was not intended merely to be a story based upon a great religious fantasy. These things were tied together. They were part of a pattern. And if you had the key, you could unlock the pattern. If you did not have the key, it remained hopelessly a mystery to you. But to possess the key was to have a knowledge of the transcendental art and all that they imply in the system of alchemical speculation. Two names I'd like to mention specially connected with the problem of alchemy this evening. One is the French alchemist Nicolas Flamel. The story of Flamel is almost unbelievable. He was a poor man who made his living by writing documents and acting as a notary. In one of his experiences, wandering around, he found a mysterious book, which was called the Book of Abraham the Jew. This book was written upon tablets of some mysterious fiber-like substance, and it contained only a certain number of leaves, and on these leaves were the entire formulas of the transmutations of metals. Flamel studied these leaves very carefully for a number of years, and finally hit upon the formula. And as a result of having found the formula, he built a number of institutions for the poor, orphanages and churches and chapels in France, and finally caused the entire formula to be carved in beautiful designs upon the arches of the Church of the Innocents in Paris. When I was in Paris just before the war, I went in search of the Church of the Innocents. Unfortunately, it has departed from us, and where it once stood is now a small and almost deserted park. I happened to be able to get hold of the gardener or caretaker who watched this park, and he told me that every so often that when they were planting and weeding and making the little flower beds to look as best they could, they would dig up bones from the old cemetery of the Church of the Innocents. And then a number of stones and a number of inscribed sections from the church had been taken into the courtyard of the Quigley Museum in Paris, where they stood around in various places. I went over there and looked them over. Some of them still showed sections of the alchemical designs of Nicolas Flamel. This mysterious man was persecuted terrifically. He gave the secret from him, but never divulged it. And is said finally to have gone to Asia. where he lived for a great length of time in company with dervishes and other mystics. He was quite a remarkable person.